Hello, everyone. We'll wait probably about 5 more minutes to see if others join.
Jared, should we have people introduce themselves?
Uh, I think, well, yeah, we can definitely do that. But I mean, ordinarily in a press briefing, we would just basically do our thing, and then if people want to ask questions, they can.
Yeah.
Let's see how many more people join. We'll wait about 5 minutes um, for those who are already on. Hi, everyone. For those just joining, we'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes. We'll just wait 1 more minute. We'll get started at 11:05. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Genzer. I'm General Counsel to the Neuro Rights Foundation. I'm delighted that you have joined us here today for our press briefing on our new report that we're issuing on consumer neurotechnologies. In terms of how the press briefing will proceed, I'm going to first introduce our chairperson, Rafael Yuste. After that, I'll provide some context and some very brief opening remarks to frame the report. And then our colleague, Stephen Damianos, will present the substance of the report itself. All of you should have received um, a press release announcing the report has been made public, as well as a copy of the report itself via a hyperlink. If you haven't, you can obviously reach out to us or send us a message in the chat, and we'll make sure you get it. Importantly, the launch of our report today is coming at a very historic moment, actually. My colleague, Dr. Yuste, and I are actually out in Colorado right now, and we're here because today Governor Jared Polis will be signing into law the first neuroprotection bill of any state in the United States, and in fact, of any major jurisdiction in the world, which will, for the first time, protect neural data as sensitive personal data. We'll talk obviously a lot more about that as well. Dr. Houston and I were actually both out in California yesterday, where we testified before the California Senate Judiciary Committee, which was considering similar legislation out there. And after a robust hearing and discussion, that committee in the state Senate adopted on a vote of 11-0 their neural rights protection bill. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rafael Yuste. He is the chair of the Neuro Rights Foundation and also a professor at Columbia University, as well as the director of its Neurotechnology lab. I can just say personally, from my own experience getting to know him and working with him now for more than 3 years, he's undoubtedly one of the world's leading experts on neurotechnologies and a pioneer in the field of not just being a scientist and a researcher and a medical doctor and technologist, but also a person who from the beginning has recognized both the extraordinary positive things that can come from the advancing of neurotechnologies, but also the downside risks. And he has been a leading figure globally in trying to raise the alarm as appropriate about the need to manage those downside risks. And so it's an honor and privilege for me to introduce Rafael Yuste. Rafa.
Thank you, Jared. Good morning, everyone. As a way to frame the issue, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal trajectory. So I'm sure that every one of you has a direct personal experiences with family members or friends that suffer some brain disease. No? And it could be Alzheimer's, it could be Parkinson, it could be epilepsy, it could be schizophrenia, stroke, you name it, mental handicap, paralysis, ALS. And you know perfectly well, painfully well, that these diseases essentially have no cure. And the reason is because as medics, we need to understand the pathophysiology of the disease in order to effectively cure it. And the pathophysiology is where the function of the organ, the physiology of an organ, goes wrong, goes pathological. So I was actually trained in medicine, and it was this frustration with treating patients with, in this case, people with schizophrenia, with paranoid schizophrenia, that drove me to go devote my life to basic research to understand the function of the brain. And the way, and I've been doing this now for 36 years in the US, first at Rockefeller University Bell Labs, and now the last few decades at Columbia. And the way we do this with many of my colleagues around the world is by developing neurotechnology. So what the hell is neurotechnology? Something very simple. There are methods or tools, devices to do two things, either to record the activity of the brain or to change the activity of the brain. We essentially get into the brain with these tools that could be electrical, they could be optical, it could be magnetic, it could be acoustical. At the end of the day, that's what we do. We get into the brain and we manipulate brain activity. And I've been working with my group in understanding the brain of mice, because mice are actually a very good model for human brain, particularly the cerebral cortex. And just about 10 years ago, we had an Oppenheimer moment. We have developed very advanced neurotechnology using lasers, optical methods to both record the activity of the brain and to change it. And we were able to, with a mouse that was looking at a visual scene at the screen, we were able to decode what he was looking at from the analysis of his brain activity. But more importantly, we were able to manipulate the brain activity. So we made the mouse see things that he wasn't seeing, that he wasn't looking at. We took over control of his perception, of the perception of the mouse. And at that point, we were able to essentially run the mouse like a puppet and make him do one thing or the other thing by putting one pattern of activity, one image into its brain or another. And that for me was, again, like an Oppenheimer moment, because I realized that what we can do in a mouse today, we can do in a human tomorrow. No? And this is when I started getting involved in this issue of neural rights, providing protection and regulation for this new technology, which I'm developing and we are developing at full speed to help patients to understand how the brain works and be able to cure these diseases. But neurotechnology has a lot of ethical and societal implications. And the reason is because the brain is not just another organ of the body, like the heart or the lung or the spleen, but happens to be the organ that generates all your mental and cognitive abilities. No? I'm talking about your thoughts, your memories, your imagination, your emotions, your behavior, even your subconscious things that you're not aware that you're carrying with are essentially generated by the brain. So if you build methods that can allow you to record and change brain activity, by definition, the same methods will allow you to decode and change mental activity. And mental activity is what defines us as a species. So this is a human rights problem, hence this neural rights approach. And with these concerns, we started this Neuro Rights Foundation with my colleague Jared Genser, an expert in international human rights, and Jamie Davis, who's an expert in the regulation of technology. And our approach in this nonprofit, we don't get paid to do this, is to do three things: to do research, outreach, and advocacy for neural rights. And I wanted to tell you that this is, by the way, not a science fiction tale. No? This is happening right now. Just a year ago, our colleague Eddie Chang at UCSF used intracranial neurotechnology to decode the language and the emotions and the facial gestures of a paralyzed patient, a woman that had a stroke, a bulbar stroke, and she was essentially locked in. And they were able to clone her mind in a computer, and through that computer, this person can communicate with the outside. And just a few months ago, a team in Australia used portable electroencephalography to decode speech from volunteers, so that what the words they were thinking could get spelled in the screen. So again, this is here now. This is not science fiction. And just to end, so our foundation has been involved in a bunch of reports in terms of our research, and today you'll hear about our latest one. We've also done a significant amount of advocacy. You've heard about our efforts in California and Colorado, and we've also been sponsors of the constitutional amendment in Chile that 2 years ago adopted an amendment that protects brain activity and the information that comes from it, and also in the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And in terms of outreach, we've made a documentary with the German director Werner Herzog on neurotechnology. The documentary is called Theater of Thought, and we can facilitate screening passes for it if you're interested. And with this, I pass the torch to my colleague Jared, who will let you know about our latest report. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rafa, for that. And now it would be the right time to return to discussing our new report that we have issued today. Let me just right now open up and share my screen. There we go. Oops. Okay. All right. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. And the report that we are launching today is entitled Safeguarding Brain Data, Assessing the Privacy Practices of Consumer Neurotechnology Companies. And what I want to do is just very briefly provide some context for the report, and then turn it over to Dr. Damianos, who has been our lead researcher on the development of this report, working in collaboration with both Rafa and myself. So let me just begin by talking about our methodology. And I think by way of context, it's worth noting that here we're talking about consumer neurotechnology products, not medical medical neurotechnology products. And it's important, this distinction is actually important to understand in terms of why we did the report on consumer neurotechnology products as well. And so it's worth just starting at the outset to say that implantable brain-computer interfaces, those that are performed through neurosurgery, are heavily regulated as medical devices by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and by others around the world. And any neural data collected from those devices that are used in a healthcare setting are also, that data is protected already under, in the United States, HIPAA, and globally under health privacy laws around the world. So our focus in the Neural Rights Foundation has not been on implantable devices because they're heavily regulated, but rather on consumer products. Consumer products, by contrast, actually all use medical grade neurotechnology devices, where the brain scanners are primarily EEG scanners, and the very same kind of EEG scanner used in a consumer product today, if it used in a medical context, would require licensing by the FDA, but because it's a consumer product and outside the healthcare context, it does not require any licensing. And the data that's collected, the neural data that's connected by consumer products, is also subject to no regulation as well. And so therefore, we wanted to understand what is out there in the world in terms of consumer products that you can buy today, and how are those products operating and functioning in the world and engaging with consumers as well. So we found there are 30 products available for purchase or pre-purchase online. In order for us to include a product in our report, it had to be available to consumers and also needed to collect neural data. We're not just looking for any kind of product connecting to consumers, but ones that are neurotechnology products in particular. In terms of our methodology for every company and its product, we gathered all of the relevant policy documents, as you can see here. We also attempted to contact every company up to 3 times to see if they had any further information they could share with us and to try to verify that we have the most recent copies of the documents as well. And then from there, we had a team of researchers going through double, triple, and quadruple checking these policy documents. And from the review of these documents, we identified 5 areas of review, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then all of the policy documents themselves were then coded against those areas of review to understand, for all the different areas that we were looking at, what precisely was the approach taken by each of these companies and their products. The 5 areas for review that we looked at related to access to information, data collection and data storage, data sharing, user rights, and data safety and security. We developed this kind of both from the top down and the bottom up. From the bottom up, we, as I mentioned, looked at all the policy documents and identified areas of concern, independent of any reference to global standards. But then subsequently, in terms of being sure of what we wanted to look at and what we wanted to focus on, we benchmarked the information that we were gathering from these different companies against global data practices. And so what you can see here are 6 different global privacy standards. The first 3, the EU, the AU, and California, these are all binding legal, legal either treaties or laws. And that means that countries within those jurisdictions, for the first 2, are required to abide by these provisions of data protection. In California as well. The latter 3 are soft law standards, guidance, but not legally binding. But what we wanted to do is to capture in our review of global practices standards that came from all of the regions of the world to demonstrate that this is a global issue as well. So let me stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Damianos, who can walk you through the findings of the report itself. It is, of course, quite dense, I'll note, 100 pages, but of course, to make it as easy as possible for you, we have an executive summary and table of contents up front that can summarize, our findings. What we also tried to do in the report, I'll just lastly note, is, we went with the assumption that most people looking at this might be learning about neurotechnologies, from nothing at the outset. And so the first 20 pages of the report approximately really try to explain, as Dr. Houston was saying, what is neurotechnologies, how do they operate and function, what are implantable devices and how do those work and what can they do, what are wearable devices and how do they operate, and then going through as well what we found in our prior market study that we did at the Neuro Rights Foundation about the scale and scope of the market, and then to start to understand these 30 products and how widely used are they and so forth. So, in toto, our report is really a self-contained document that would enable you not only to look at consumer neurotech products and their data practices, but also understand where does that fit within the broader world of neurotechnologies today. So let me stop there and turn it over to Dr. Dramyannis. Stephen.
Thank you so much, Jared. So I am now going to share my screen to bring us to the same presentation, which I believe you should all be seeing now. And I'm just going to pull that up. So as my colleague Jared mentioned, we are quickly distilling a 100-page, very dense report into a few slides, but hopefully this will give you a bit of a flavor of what we are dealing with here and a sense of what is occurring today. And as both my colleagues mentioned, this is not a tomorrow problem. There are already products on the market. We identified only 30 of them, but there are more that, at the end of this call, you or I could go online and put our credit card information in and own our own device. So these are data practices that are occurring today. The first of the 5 categories that I want to discuss is access to information. The reason that this category is so essential to discuss and why we start with it is because the data collection landscape operates on a paradigm known as notice and consent. And the way that this paradigm works is that companies inform a consumer or a potential consumer of the practices that will govern the collection of their data and the rights that they have over it. And then the consumer or the potential consumer can then exercise consent in deciding whether or not to engage with the product and the company. And so it's important to understand the first word of that, notice and notification. So we want to understand what type of notice are consumers given. So the very first question to ask is, are there even privacy policies on the website that can help the user understand how their data is being used? We find that for the majority of the companies, the answer is yes. But concerningly, for over 1/4 of the companies, there was not a policy on a privacy policy on the website. And we found that there was instead what's known as a web-only policy. So this is the type of policy that we maybe annoyingly click through when we're on a website that's asking us about cookies. But it's not actually commenting on the neurotechnology device or neural data. They're only commenting on tracking information or cookies for the website. So this is a very strong finding, which shows us that in some cases, but not in all, do the companies even provide any information to consumers about how their neural data will be used. Another consideration that's very important to consider is, does the company give you a way of asking them questions about your data or your rights? We found that, and we were happy to find that 100% of the companies, in fact, do have one or more mechanisms for contacting them, whether through an email address that they provide or a contact form on the website. But we found actually that the 100% rate did not carry over to a response rate. So over a number of months, our team did a series of waves of outreach to the companies. We reached out to each company one time, and if they didn't reply, we had 2 follow-ups over the following months, in which we were just asking for some information about their data practices and user rights. A little over 1/3 of the companies replied, while the remaining did not. So again, here we're seeing a picture start to color in where potential consumers of neurotechnology are entering the neurotechnology landscape with a blindfold on. They do not know what rights they have as users, and they largely do not know what the company can and cannot do in relation to their data. Lastly, the question of access to information is not a static question because the company will be retaining your data, as we'll discuss. It doesn't only matter what the policies are at the time of collection, it matters whether those policies change, because it's very possible that over time the practices that govern your data or your rights even could change if there's new ownership in the company, for example, or just if their corporate practices change. We find that there's vast ambiguity in terms of whether or not the companies actually meaningfully inform consumers of changes to policy documents. A majority of them actually say that they encourage the consumer to come back regularly, every few months even, to check the privacy policies themselves to see if there are any updates. But we know there's a vast body of literature that shows that comprehension and reading of privacy policies is quite low, let alone following up again and again to continue to return to that policy and try and see if anything has changed. That level of rigor and that level of dedication to interacting with the privacy policy over time is unfortunately not one that is realistic when considering the consumer landscape. So here we find that the access to information is not at all on par with international standards, which prioritize openness, transparency, and communication. At a minimum, we would understand that a company would need to provide policy documents, a functioning mechanism to contact the company, and notifications of policy documents, of changes to policy documents. And yet, of the 30 companies that we assessed, only 4 of them meet this standard by providing all of them. But further, none of the companies actually explain the unique sensitivities of neural data, which means that functionally none of the companies fully provide adequate access to information. So moving on to our second category, data collection and storage. It's a natural next category after understanding how the company informs you and whether or not they inform you of the data practices. Then the question becomes, okay, well, what are the data practices themselves? Something that really surprised us was that, and remember, what we're talking about here are companies that are selling devices, wearable devices, which are able to access and store, interpret your neural data. The majority of the companies in their policy documents do not have any mention of neural data. They focus on types of data such as your credit card information, your home address, cookies, tracking technologies, but there's not actually a explicit mention of the type of data that we are here talking about and that we are concerned about due to its extreme sensitivity. And I just want to make sure it's clear what that means. So that's akin to a consumer genetic testing company describing the methods with which they can protect your credit card information, but leaving it entirely vague what they do with your genetic information. Or a laboratory telling you in great detail how they will safeguard information such as your home address, but leaving it entirely unknown whether they have any mechanisms to safeguard the results of your blood work. So this is the type of situation that we're dealing with here. All of the hard and soft law instruments that my colleague Jared mentioned earlier have a clear prioritization for the need of data minimization, which is a principle that requires anyone who's collecting data to only collect the amount of data that is required, the smallest amount that is required for the effective functioning of the product. So we here wanted to understand, are there practices in place for the consumer neurotechnology companies to limit the amount of neural data that they are collecting from consumers or not? We find that as far as the policy documents go, the vast majority, almost 90%, fail to have any mention of any type of practice that would try to minimize the amount of data that they are either collecting or keeping on file. And a related finding that we have is that if consumers are going to the companies trying to understand for how long the companies can retain their neural data, they might have an answer, but they might not, because about 63% of the companies provided some information. Maybe they said, after you delete your account, we delete all information after 90 days or something like that. They gave a clear timeline, but the vast majority of them either said that explicitly that the data could be held indefinitely or had no mention of it, which leaves us to assume that certainly that practice could be occurring. So moving on to data sharing, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but we're going to have some time for some questions at the end where we can talk through all of this a bit more. So in terms of data sharing, this is a really key question as well, because as a consumer or prospective consumer, you want to understand not only how much information, for example, a company can hold about you, but also who will have access to that information. And as my colleagues mentioned, neural data is an extremely sensitive type of data that can reveal really, really intimate information about individuals. And so this is an incredibly important category for us. And I should note also that we found, before I dive into this category, looking at the 30 companies, 29 of the 30 companies, so that's 96% or so, seem to have full access to their consumers' neural data and don't have any meaningful limitations on who at the company, for example, can access that data. So with that in mind, understanding that the companies can access these, for example, brain scans of individuals whenever they want, because, for example, they're uploaded to a company server as opposed to being localized on a device that the consumer owns, data sharing becomes particularly pertinent to understand. We find that the vast majority of companies either explicitly say that they can share data or do not have any mention of it. When we put that together, we have almost 100% of the companies, just slightly under 100% of the companies seem to be able to share without many limitations at all data with third parties. And then the picture is quite similar when looking at the sale of data. Only 13% of the companies in their policies explicitly say that the sale of data is prohibited. And so we surmise from that, of course, that companies can not only harvest and mine large amounts of this extremely sensitive information, but they can also share and monetize and sell it without many limitations. So now we turn to our penultimate category, which is user rights. And of course, the user, any consumer wants to understand what rights do they have in relation to the company and what rights do they have in relation to their data. And so two of the most commonly respected user rights in the half a dozen policies and I'm sorry, not policies, international standards, hard and soft law standards that we analyzed. Two of the most important ones are withdrawal of consent to processing data and requesting deletion of data. So on the point of withdrawing consent, this again comes back to the understanding that in no setting in the world is consent understood as one time and static. Consent is always understood as a dynamic, iterative process, and it is the same in the data landscape. And just because someone consents to their data being used in a certain way one day does not mean that they will feel the same way about it another day. And so they should be able to express that that has changed. We see an almost 50-50 split here, where a little over 50% of the companies do, in fact, allow for withdrawal of consent to process data, while about 50%, a little under, have no mention of it. And then on the other side, we see that similarly, just a little bit under 50% do explicitly allow data deletion. And so if we then put these two user rights together and analyze all of the 30 companies, we find that 12 companies allow for both withdrawal of consent and deletion of data. But I have to note that this number is deceptively high because the vast majority of companies, as we've already seen on the previous slide, can transfer your data to third parties almost immediately. And in most of the cases, you upload all of your neural data onto a cloud that is owned by the company, which means that by the time you withdraw consent to processing, or the time that you request deletion of your data, it is highly possible and highly likely that many other third-party individuals have already had access to or have purchased the very data that you are now trying to remove. So that's just a really important point to mention, because this number 40% is actually somewhat deceptive. Lastly, we consider data safety and security. As I've alluded to, as my colleagues have mentioned, the type of data that we're talking about here is extremely sensitive. And by the day, by the month, as there are growing advances in generative AI and scientific advances, the sensitivity even grows because the insights that can be gleaned from this data grow enormously. So we wanted to, of course, understand what type of protections are in place. Do consumers enter into these relationships with the product and with the company confidently, knowing that their neural data is being appropriately safeguarded, or at least safeguarded to in a commensurate measure with the sensitivity of the data? So one of the questions we looked at is, does the company de-identify data? It's a much longer conversation that my colleague, Dr. Yuste, would be much more appropriate to discuss about the complexities of de-identifying and re-identifying neural data, but I'll leave that to him later if he cares to remark on it. But we find that, again, something of an even split, with a little over 50% of the companies saying that they de-identified data, and then over 40% not having any mention of the practice. We see in terms of encryption, of course, this is extremely important when we remember that most of the time this data is held on cloud servers. So we want to know, are these cloud servers vulnerable to some sort of cyber attack, or, what practices are there to make sure and give the consumer confidence that there will not be unintended disclosures of their information. And we see that only actually 20% of the companies explicitly commit to encrypting this type of data that is so sensitive, while the other 80% have no mention of encryption practices at all. And then lastly, on this point, we see similar trends in terms of notification of security breach. And I'll just note that this point on notification is widely understood in both hard and soft law standards around the world as very central, and central to the notion also of access to information and transparency, that the consumer needs to understand what is happening to their data. And so if there's a security breach, and we've just mentioned, of course, that most of the data is not encrypted, so the consumer would want to know about a security breach. Over almost 85% of the companies seem to not actually notify consumers of these breaches. So we see vast deficiencies here in terms of the protection and safeguarding of this type of data. So where does this leave us? It leaves us, of course, with an understanding that there is an enormous gap between the stated policies and data practices of consumer neurotechnology companies and international privacy standards. There's an overwhelming lack of access to information, which partially stems from the fact that not even all of the companies have privacy policies, and many of them don't even mention neural data at all. The notice and consent model upon which the very notion of a privacy document is premised falls apart because there is not meaningful notification, and therefore the consumer cannot meaningfully consent. At the same time, we see an enormous amount of control given to the company over the collection, storage, retention, repurposing, and even sale of neural data, either internally or externally to third-party actors. And of course, this raises serious concerns that we've alluded to and that we can certainly discuss more in the questions and answers. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, really rapid increases in the technological capability of new scientific breakthroughs and generative AI are making this a problem that is more and more dire. And I think we are all tired of hearing my voice at this time, so I will hand it back to my colleagues, Jared Genzer and Raphael Yuste.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So now we will turn it over to people to ask questions. I have a couple of requests here privately to me about linking to the report, so I've now put it in the chat box. But one of the questions that a journalist put in the chat box to me directly, but Stephen, I'll kick to you to answer, is they said that I covered neurotech before, but only medical devices like Synchron and Neuralink. What devices are we talking about here? Could you give me some examples? I struggle to understand what we're talking about.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'll admit, I also struggled to understand what we were talking about when I first started with this work. These were not technologies that I was aware of. And I was really surprised when I found out about the growing prevalence of these devices. In our report, we created 3 different categories, really, for these products. So some of the products, for example, fall into a category that we call wellness. Some fall into a category that we refer to as recreation. And the remainder fall into a category that we label research. So let's start with the first category, wellness. As my colleagues mentioned, these products are not medical devices. And the companies well know that, because if they were to be medical devices, they would fall under an entirely different and more rigorous regulatory regime. And so rather than speaking through a language of medicine or a language of health, many of these companies speak in a language of wellness. And so there's a lot of products that, for example, someone could use while meditating. And this would be a headband that they could wear that while they are engaging in a meditative session, the wearable neurotechnology device supposedly tracks their neural activity during the session and then gives them insights afterwards about how deep their meditative state was, whether their concentration drifted. We see a lot of the language of flow and concentration. There are several devices that, for example, there's one that is marketed for use while playing golf so that you can focus on reaching your peak productivity, and you can focus on whether or not your levels of concentration are drifting. These are the types of products that we would label as, yes, thank you, Jared, for sharing that. We would label these as wellness. So maybe they're focused on meditation or for use while working or while studying. Then there are some that are more explicitly recreational. And these, for example, could be, there's one product we look at which is a small helicopter that supposedly flies, and its height and speed is responsive to neural activity measured through your levels of concentration, or a hologram that changes based off of exactly how you're thinking or concentrating. We're also increasingly finding a community of gamers and hobbyists who are embracing consumer neurotechnology and integrating neurotechnology devices into their gaming products. And so that's another area we see where it's really focused on just fun and recreation, as opposed to focused on self-betterment or some sort of health-related or not health, wellness-related trajectory. The last category that I mentioned and that we focus on in the report is research. And so traditionally, these products have been confined to laboratory settings and hospitals. But increasingly, there are communities of people, whether they be the hobbyists that I mentioned, or others who are just curious about the brain and want to access neural data outside of laboratory settings. And so these are, unlike the other products, these are less user-friendly. Maybe you can't get them just out of the box and put them on your head. Maybe they require some more assembly. Maybe they require some higher levels of understanding about the human brain. But there are many products that you or I could buy today that would allow us to access raw neural data and then either create some programming off of that, either analyze it ourselves or integrate it into other platforms. I invite either of my colleagues to add.
No, thanks for that, Stephen. I would note that, and I've sent the link up to the report in the chat box, that if you open it up, both in the text of the report itself, we provide a summary of the 30 different products, and then actually as an appendix to the report, we provide a page or two of how the companies advertise themselves, as well as the links to all of their policy documents as well. So let me see at this point if there's anyone further who would like to ask any questions of any of us.
Hi. Sorry.
Yeah,
Can you hear
please. Yes.
Yeah. I'm just wondering how widespread this market is. Do we have any idea of how many of such devices? Like, are we talking about 100 users in the world or 2 million users? Just an idea. And also, you started answering that question, Stephen, just now, but still, from what I've seen of these devices so far, it was like, sure, it can help you focus or sleep, but it's outside your brain, and it did not seem like something that you can influence the perception of the person or harvest their data. But you're telling me, no, you can actually do that. And do people actually do that already?
So in terms of I'll take one crack at it, and then Rafa and Stephen, please join in. But I think in terms of how widely used are these devices, I think that we have to go on what the companies themselves are saying. And some companies are saying a lot about how much they do, and others of them are saying very little about how much they do. But for example, I'm looking here right now at some of these. For example, the company Muse says that it has over 200,000 users. Let me look here. Emotive says that they have collected 100 million minutes of the EEG data across 800,000 sessions. So you can find further information about that to the extent that we have it in our report itself. I would, what I would say is that, obviously we're not just concerned about where these devices are today, but also where are they heading. And so we also emphasize in our report that three of the biggest tech companies in the world are developing consumer neurotech products. And so that includes Meta, which through Control Labs is developing a wristband device. We also have Apple, which recently got a patent, filed a patent application to attach EEG scanners to the next generation of AirPods as well. And then the company Snap is developing, which runs Snapchat, is developing a consumer neurotech device that will connect to its virtual reality products. So the moment that any of those three devices, for example, comes on the market, we'll see millions of people adopting these technologies. We're not probably at millions yet, but we're on our way. I think in terms of the information itself, and again, Rafa can follow up on this, all of the consumer products that are being sold today are using medical grade EEG or other devices. And so in terms of the quality of the information that's being downloaded, it means that all of these devices, even if you're doing a single scan, are talking about gathering gigabytes of data, of neural data on a person. And if you're talking about wearing one of these devices, for example, overnight for a sleep study, you're talking terabytes of data that are being downloaded. These devices need less than 1% of the data that they are downloading to perform the work of the device itself, which are more narrowly purposed neurotechnology products. And so you have this massive additional quantity of neural data that is being gathered. It's already the case today that with EEG scans, for example, you can diagnose certain brain diseases such as epilepsy. And so any of these companies right now, for example, just to take epilepsy as an example, if they wanted to look at any of their users and see if they had epilepsy without the user's consent, they could go ahead and figure that out right now with the existing brain scanning devices that they are already using. It's also worth noting that it's these very same kinds of devices, an EEG scanner, as I said, for all but one or two of these products, that when combined with generative AI in Australia led to a recent study that was published of thought to text translation. And an Australian study that was published recently in the last 3 months found that with using an EEG scanner and generative AI, they have been able now to decode human thought at a 40 to 60% accuracy rate. It's long been the case that you could do thought to text with implantable devices, but obviously this is a major step forward with wearable devices. And we're probably only talking a couple of years before that accuracy rate rises to 90% plus, which would mean that all this data that's being downloaded, and as Stephen noted, most of these companies keep this data for very long or unlimited periods of time, could later come back to these EEG scans, and with new software developed that use Gen AI, could come back and decode later what you were thinking at the time you were wearing their devices. So today we're I think, really focused on, anyway, let me turn it over to Rafa. Rafa, it sounds like
just very, very quickly, since we don't have that much time, we should keep our answers very brief so that everyone can ask questions. So we actually, 2 years ago, we released a report, the market analysis on neurotechnology, and I put a link in the chat. And already 2 years ago, we estimated that the size of the market was $33 billion and growing at about 30% per year. So this is a big market. The decoding of language is not yet a feature that's available in many of these consumer neurotech products, but it's likely going to happen. And also the influence in brain activity to enhance memory, for example, is something that's not yet available in these consumer neurotech products, but this is something that has already been done in the research and in the clinic. So this is also something likely to happen. And maybe if someone from our team could put a link to the Australian study for Timmy, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. I think I did just put it in the chat. Do people see that there?
Yes, it's there.
Okay, great.
Great.
All right, are there further questions?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Timmy Broderick. I'm with Stat News, and I wanted specifically to maybe dig down on that last point that we were talking about a little bit more, and both the sort of larger scale worries of like mind control and other things that seem possible down the line based off of what you talked about, Rafa, earlier with like the mouse. And that seems like a little bit farther down the line. I'm curious, like right now in the 30 companies that you have highlighted, like short term, what sort of damage could you do? And obviously the types of data is different depending on the different companies, but like storing it for a later date when it can be analyzed by an EEG, obviously those are real problems, but like in the short term, what do consumers have to fear about this specific issue?
I'll take a quick crack at this. Thank you, Timmy, for the question. So there's two types of neurotechnology: the neurotechnology to record brain activity and to manipulate brain activity. And just like when you learn the language, a foreign language is much easier to read it than to speak it. The same thing with brain activity. It's much easier to decode than to reprogram or manipulate. So because of that, there's a delay And the decoding technology, particularly with AI, is here now already. And as you mentioned, the biggest concern that we have is a privacy concern, the access to cognitive and mental information about the person. The manipulation of brain activity is something that we've already achieved in mice, but it hasn't. It's on its way to be carried on to humans. The most significant work that has been done with non-invasive manipulation of brain activity was a study by Boston University enhancing memory, short-term memory and long-term memory in volunteers by about 30% with magnetic stimulation. So these are devices that are not yet, they haven't yet reached the market, but I'm sure they will. Sooner or later, we will find out that there is a company that sells magnetic stimulator to enhance memory. And this would be the beginning of the second wave for neurotechnology reaching the marketplace, not just for decoding, but also to manipulate. And at that point, that's where this risk would become more significant, because recording brain activity is essentially harmless. No? But once you manipulate brain activity, you can change mental and cognitive ability. Essentially, everything that we are can be accessed and changed.
Commercially available products to alter activity, do you think a year, 2 years, 5 years?
Well, there is already a vibrant maker community that builds brain stimulators. And some of these people use these brain stimulators every day, and they call it microdosing. But that hasn't quite reached the marketplace as far as we know. No? I mean, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think definitely within 5 years, I could imagine that there would be, the way that consumer neurotech is growing, that it will spill over from just devices to decode brain activity for gaming and these things you've heard about, to devices to actually enhance your performance, your mental performance, memory, concentration, and even behavior.
But one, I mean, in terms of coming back to the other part of your question, Timmy, on what can be done today by these devices, because these user agreements and privacy agreements are so opaque. We of course have no idea what they're actually doing, and these are primarily privately held companies, and so they're not reporting in much detail what they're doing. I think my biggest fear of what could be done right now, and we don't have any evidence to be very, very clear that this is happening, but they don't have to tell you based on the way these agreements are written, is that any one of these companies, for example, could be using medical grade software running against the EEG and diagnosing in their users, even if you were flying a helicopter, because it's an EEG scan of medical grade quality, you could diagnose that the person has one of a number of different brain diseases. If they wanted to do that systematically, and it was, let's say if one of the bigger companies were doing it, you could gather data on hundreds of thousands of users, run it privately and secretly against medical grade software, and start selling to insurance companies information about brain diseases that these people might actually have. And there's nothing in these devices, user and privacy agreements today that would guarantee that couldn't happen. So with the exception of one of the devices, there's only one of the 30 devices which keeps its data only on its local device, and that company itself never actually accesses the data through the cloud or upload or otherwise. Again, we're really in the beginning days here of consumer neurotechnologies. I mean, there are 30 products available, but I think that the moment that any of these major tech companies launches one of their devices, the next generation AirPod with an EEG scanner built into it, into both of your ears, and we have millions and millions of users, you're going to see enormous focus on this question in the public discourse. And I think what we're trying to do right now in our work around the world, and our work in Colorado and California, as examples just from the last 2 days, is put in place the kinds of protections against misuse and abuse of the technologies today that would prevent, when this goes to the much wider mass market, those neural data being harvested and misused.
Awesome.
So
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, we've come to the end of the time, but if there's any last question, we can take, let's say, one more question if there's any further questions. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming this morning, and we will continue to do our work, push it out there, and are grateful for your interest and your coverage. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.